All right. So, thank you for speaking with me, Mr. McMillen. You're a retired pastor, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk to me about these topics. So, I guess we'll start from the top. First question for you is, do you personally feel that Anselm's ontological argument has a strong message in support of God?
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Yeah, just let me begin by saying it's my privilege to be able to share in this interview and to be a part of your class, and that I'll do my best to answer and to give a response. Let me say, though, that first, the ontological argument is really just a philosophical study that establishes the reality of existence, and it can be the existence of really just about anything. But in regard to Anselm's ontological argument, I think his argument in its totality is difficult. It's difficult for many to understand or comprehend, but to answer your question, I believe yes, his argument does give support of the existence of God, but it begins in the mind. And the theoretical truth in his argument is that there is nothing greater that can be conceived that is greater than God. And that's what gives his argument strong support. So therefore, God exists. But it's also, I feel, a contradiction to suppose that we can imagine a being greater than the greatest possible being that could be imagined in the mind. It's difficult to even understand that. But God's existence is not just limited to our own imaginations or our own understandings or even the definitions in our own feeble way that we attempt to give him. So Anselm, in my opinion, does not by chance or by accident add existence as a property to God. And so therefore, since he does not do that, he does not define him into existence. He simply stated that God exists, and he exists as an idea of the mind. So to say that, yes, his argument gives support to the existence of God, yes, it does, but there's so much more that can be said than just that.
Okay, that's a very good way to put it. I guess my follow-up to that would be, with your statement being that yes, it does, and no, it doesn't. Do you believe that the ontological argument could convince someone who doesn't believe in God, or someone who questions what they believe in, whether it be God, or maybe they believe something along the lines of the Christian religion, but overall, do you believe that argument that God exists in the mind, but also he's the greatest being ever? Do you believe that could convince someone who does not believe in God itself?
I believe, and I think that as we get into our discussion a little later, I'm going to try to develop that thought. But yes, I think oftentimes if a person is seeking out and trying to understand if God really does exist, he may be coming from the standpoint of there is no God. And so he's trying to prove that there is a God from the stance that there is no God. So he's trying to go from that direction. And so if he is coming from that point of view, Anselm's ontological argument would give him an opportunity to grow from that and to accept the idea, yes, that God does exist, basically from his argument.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that later in his argument, something that he says along the lines of, in response to, I believe you say Ganilo, something like that.
Yeah.
When he responds to him, he says, when we'll get to this question later, but about the perfect island objection, his argument when he says, I can't remember the exact quote, but something along the lines of, if you can't replace perfect island with God, you can't do that, because you can't imagine God. There's something along the lines of that phrase. I think that really supports what you're saying.
Because once you imagine perfect, what perfect is, and then you add God into the equation, it becomes even more perfect. And
Yep.
that's even harder to imagine.
Exactly. I agree with that. So I guess then that the next question on the same topic, do you feel that the concept of realism helps the ontological argument, or does it question its validity? Does it actually take away from it? And by realism, I'm specifically talking about um, the doctrine of realism. So like the whole concept of realism itself, not just a specified version of it. If you understand what I'm saying.
I think I do. I think Anselm's concept of reality and his ontological argument for the existence of God is somewhat weak when you talk about realism, you talk about reality, because he's not talking about reality in his argument. He's more talking about concepts. He's more talking about what's imagined in the mind rather than the reality of God existing in our sphere of existence. And his argument leaves little of any room, in my opinion, for belief and faith in a sovereign, living, personal God that is supremely at work in our world. And that's where the reality of God exists. He exists because he is at work in our world. We may not see him, but he is. He's at work in your life, in my life, and others,
Yes.
speaking to us and using us. He's a God that in reality expresses love. That's not just an idea. It's difficult to explain or define, but love is real.
Yes.
And God expresses that love for us and for others. He cares for us. He provides for us. He provides the salvation that is needed for his children to be able to experience the fullness of his joy and the fullness of his experience that he intends and desires for us to have. So the reality of Anselm's ontological argument is basically, he's, in my opinion, he is still having it captured in his mind.
Yes.
And he's still trying to work God out of his mind into the reality of existence. And so that leaves little room, if any, for belief and faith in a sovereign God. He's trying to acknowledge God in his mind and not his heart. And I've often said that the greatest distance in the world is 18 inches. And that's the distance from your mind to your heart. And once your heart accepts the fact that God is real, then he becomes real in your mind.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. I'd never heard that before. I think one point you made in there about that God is a God of love. I think that I just think of the ark and I think, is he always a God of love? But I digress. I think it's very funny how some people who don't believe in God and, stick to realism. Well, how can God exist if I can't see him? If he's not acting on this, there was an earthquake. Why didn't he stop it? Those people who believe in realism and the proof of that, they don't listen to the argument of, well, he's all around us. It's love. He's a God of love. So I completely agree with what you're saying. I understand
And
that.
also history. Let's go back to what you were talking about. Why do not people believe in the existence of God? Why did he allow the earthquakes to happen? Why did he allow this to happen? If you go back in the history to the very beginning of recorded time, where we have God demonstrating his presence through the deliverance of his people, for instance, from Egypt, as an example of that.
Yeah.
Taking them through the Red Sea and opening up that sea for them to travel across, where he has been able to heal people of diseases, or he's been able to provide in miraculous ways that only he could do. And yet people don't want to believe that he did that. They wouldn't believe if he stopped the earthquakes from happening. They wouldn't believe if he did the miraculous in our day and time either. So, but God does exist and he's at work.
And I would also include with that, I would add on to that and say that I think another thing about love is a test. There's always testing in love. You're not, my best example is my parents, but everyone has an example of love in their life. I hope so, at least.
Yeah.
And I think that with all love, there comes tests. And I really believe that, you know, if God were to solve all the problems on the world, there'd be nothing to test humanity. They would become complacent, or they wouldn't care as much about each other or about things that they like. So I think it's an interesting concept that, you know, God, you know, he's a God of love, but love isn't just defined as solving everything for everyone. So I think that kind of actually takes away from people's argument when they say, God doesn't exist, this happened to me. That doesn't really help your case, you know? So I agree with that. I do. I think it's a good point. We had mentioned it earlier, but Ganilo and his perfect island objection, when he uses this to critique the ontological argument, personally, before I get into the question, I feel as if it was a very reasonable objection. It wasn't completely out of the question. I personally, when I first read it, I saw it as viable, but then, you know, more research, the more you dig in. But my question to you is, do you agree with it, or do you think it's wrong?
Thank you, Joseph. I think that Galileo's use of the perfect island as an illustration in his ontological argument can float a lot of different ways, and it can be interpreted a lot of different ways, but just thinking by itself doesn't make it so. You know, just because you think it's a perfect island, or you think that there's no other island as perfect as it is, just does not make it so. So therefore, in a sense, it's not valid. It's not coherent to be able to understand, because one simply cannot argue into or out the existence of God. You can't argue his existence, that he does exist. You can't argue that he doesn't exist, because he's indefinable. He's not an abstract thought. He's not just a concept. He's not a thing. And the general point that Gunnil makes is, if Anselm's argument works, if it does, then only the concepts that are entirely defined in terms of properties that admit to some sort of basic upper limit is at play here. So, you know, there's a maximum that Anselm is referring to, and Gunnil makes the argument that if this is going to work, and if it's going to work at all, it's only going to work for those concepts that are entirely defined in terms of what those upper limits are. And I think that's his general point, really. But God is that. He is the upper limit. Yes. But once you reach that upper limit, he becomes even more. Yeah. God is always becoming. That's systematic theology. He's always becoming. When you think that you have understood God, he becomes that much more. He becomes that much more. And he continually does that. In the Old Testament, when Moses was approached by God in the burning bush on the backside of Mount Sinai, when God spoke to him to go and lead his children out of Egypt. And Moses at that time was a herdsman, and he had escaped from Egypt. He had been raised in aristocracy there, but he was a Hebrew. And he had killed another person. And so he was running from that judgment. And he went to the backside of Mount Sinai in the wilderness area there. And a bush that burned but wasn't consumed caught his attention. So he went a little closer, and that bush revealed himself to Moses as saying, I am the great I am. So you're telling me to go and bring your children, the Hebrew children, my kinsmen, out of their slavery and out of their bondage. Well, who shall I tell them has told me to come to lead them out? And he said, you just tell them I am sent you. Now, what does that tell me? That tells me that God always was. He always was. He was always greater. He is the great I am. His miraculous acts of deliverance and healing and provision throughout history has demonstrated his existence. There's none greater. He cannot be compared to anything else. So when we try to define him, or we try to imagine him in our mind, or to say something that it only works once you reach that upper limit, then we're not really demonstrating his existence, because he's more than that. He's more than that. There's none greater. In fact, his very word, the Bible, as we look at it, it's his word. He spoke, and he brought everything into existence, including our ability to reason and talk and reason things out, as we are doing right here this evening.
Yeah.
God gave us that ability. So that's the ontological argument that God exists.
I love that. And I think one thing you said in particular really struck out to me, because it was something that made me really believe when you said God is not an abstract thought. That right there, that was not like right now, obviously, but previously when I had, done my research, I've been to church. He's not. He's more than that. And that's what you just said. And I really think that was my issue with the objection. When Neil makes that objection, when he says that, how can you imagine that? Well, God's greater than that. You can't compare. It's not a comparison. So that I completely agree with, and I understand that. My only follow-up to that would be for the objection. Was there a point in your life where you did agree with that objection? I know you took these courses long times ago, but was there ever a point where you read Anselm's argument and you read the objection and you said, I don't know, I kind of like this objection here? Was there ever a point in time, or never?
I don't think so, because I often approached, and I say that we should never approach a point. We should try to do it as objectively as we can. And I've got to say, I probably approached it with a prejudiced viewpoint. I already knew what I believed, and I wasn't going to be swayed one way or the other. But as I studied, now I will have to say this, as I studied, I began to understand more how he thought, and I began to understand more why he thought the way he did. And I thought, if he lived in the day and time in which we live today, would we understand him? Would he be understood?
Yeah.
So I think yes, he would. And his language would be much different than the way he used it back then. It would be much more clear.
I agree. I think that's a good way to put it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, honestly. And like I told you, I mean, this whole, what we're talking about right now, this is what helped me believe in the first place. So I appreciate the clarification. On to the next.
Okay,
so
great.
In your opinion, do you view the ontological, I keep stuttering on that.
That's a hard word.
I know, and repeating it. Do you view the ontological argument as a theistic or non-theistic way to contemplate the concept of God and his existence?
Okay. Again, as I stated just previous, you asked me about Anselm's argument. Did that have an influence on me? And I said, no, not really, because I approached it with a prejudiced point of view to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So I already pretty much knew what I believed and why I believed and that, but as I studied him, it did open up different concepts. But as I look at what you're asking here, I think if we are going to argue ontologically to determine or to understand the nature or the existence of God, we have to do so beginning from the stance that there is no God in an effort to prove his existence. So we start from a non-theistic point of view. And if we argue, as I was telling you I did previously, if we argue from a prejudiced viewpoint, you know what happens? We skew the results.
Okay.
The results are not accurate. And so what we must do is we must let God and not ourselves and our opinions or our attempt to define him. We should let God speak for himself. Bertrand Russell said, it's much easier to be persuaded that ontological arguments are no good than it is to say what's wrong with them. I like that.
That's a very good quote. Wow.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
a good
it's
point.
easier to say that those arguments are not worth anything. Why even get into them than to try to get into them and explain why they're no good. So
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree. I think that's a very eloquent point, and I think that my follow-up question may have been a little bit too much like my question I asked you, but like the previous follow-up question I had. But I think that one thing that makes it interesting is that in this class, I've learned that there are people who disagree with the ontological argument that are, non-theistic, and there are people who agree with it that are theistic, which can kind of conflict. So I think it's interesting that the most objective way to tackle the issue and understand the argument is to approach it from a non-theistic way. I would really like to look in the viewpoint of someone who believes in that argument wholeheartedly, does not have any contradictions to the argument, just says, I believe in it, and also, has a strong belief in God. I think that'd be a very interesting thing to look into. But
I really think that's the way we need to approach that argument, is that if we go in with a prejudiced viewpoint, if we already go in and argue to defend our case,
yes,
okay, then we've skewed the results. And we simply need to go in unbiased,
yeah,
without prejudice. And that, I think, is from a non-theistic point of view. So in that non-theistic point of view, we're trying to show that God does exist, either in our minds or through reality, or through some other portal that God is going to make himself known.
okay, I agree.
Okay.
And then,
Star Wars has a big thing with that too, the force is with you.
oh,
So
you saw my Star Wars poster right here.
I
Then.
did. And I know your dad's a big Star Wars guy too. So
Oh, we both are. We both are.
awesome. You're okay then.
So then for the last question, I'll just read it through, and it's more of a discussion question based off your answer, to be honest, but however it goes. As someone of a higher religious understanding, someone who's preached to people and has gone over the topics, maybe not the exact topics, but the ideas basically over and over, does it personally help your belief? And have you seen a change? And by change, I'm specifically asking, do you see when you preach, or when you used to preach, and you tackle an issue like this, does it change people's minds? I'm sorry if I'm not being clear enough, but what I'm
No,
trying
you're fine. No, I get it. And I still do preach and teach. I'm just not pastoring a church presently.
Okay.
I'm retired from that aspect of my life, but I'm still very much involved in my church life. It's just not professionally. But I am teaching groups of people, neighborhood groups and small groups, and other classes of discipleshiping, that type of thing. So yes, it's important to understand that God exists and why he exists. And when you try to explain that to other people who are maybe seeking to understand themselves, it's best what you believe and why you believe what you believe before you can ever tell them or share with them.
Yes.
Because you want to be as accurate as you can. So my point in what I try to do, and if I'm going to use Anselm's ontological argument that God exists, but he exists in the mind, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to reduce down to the lowest common denominator in the statement that God exists and that nothing is greater than God. So I want to make it as simple as I possibly can. So in mathematical terms, I want to reduce everything down to its lowest common denominator and begin from there, and allow people to see and allow them to ask questions. And his ontological argument helps support my belief and my understanding of God as being the greatest. But his argument cannot define God, nor can his argument determine or begin to understand the many characteristics and the many qualities that are attributed to God. The foundation of my belief, my faith, And my understanding of God does not come from the various ontological arguments of Anselm or Juanillo or Kant or any of the others. The foundation of my belief and my faith and my understanding of God first comes from the Word of God, which is the Bible. And from there, then His Word reveals Himself to be the greatest that there is. And then as I read these other ontological arguments, I find myself coming in line with them, or I find myself separating from them for a variety of reasons. If they do support and coincide and go along with what God says in His Word that He is,
Yes.
because that's who God is. He is. Now then, I will tell you that I've stated all that my belief and my faith come from the foundation of understanding that the belief in God, the existence of God, comes from His Word, because He says, I am. Everything was created by me. In the very beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I know He believes in me. I know that because I know He loves me. And I know He lives because He lives in me. And He's renewed me, and He's transformed my way of thinking and living from the old way of living to a new way of living and thinking. That was not possible before I came into my understanding of the existence of God. And go back to what I said earlier, His love for me. That's what transformed my life. I know Him, and I'm loved by Him because that's who He is. He is love.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I really hope one day to have that level of understanding. I'm still the beginner level. I'm the base, but I really do.
You'll surprise yourself, Joseph.
That's such an eloquent way to put it. I think the only follow-up I have to that would be, you mentioned that that's how that affects your belief. And as I said, I think that's a wonderful way to put it. Have you ever, in a service or privately, or as currently, as you said, have you ever talked about the ontological argument, or has that kind of been a topic you don't discuss in a service or otherwise?
I have not labeled it as such in a service.
Yes.
Labeled it as such. Here's the ontological argument that God exists. If I were to share that in a service or teaching a class of seekers, of learners, of beginners in their faith, it would skate right over their head. So I have to reduce it down to its lowest common denominator, so that they understand it. But yes, I do. And what I need to understand, and I think everyone for that matter, if we are conversing with someone or sharing with someone in whatever way who really has no concept of the truths of God or of God's existence, and we're trying to encourage them to believe, or we're encouraging them to at least consider the existence of God, we have to understand that we by ourselves are not going to do that. That number one, I am an ambassador for God. I represent Him, and I don't have to defend Him. He can defend Himself. And His Word speaks through me. So I have to be open to, and I have to study, and I have to be available to God to use me, for Him to use me. Because if I get up to try to just speak in my own abilities or in my own intelligence or knowledge, I'm going to fall flat on my face.
Yeah.
And I have. So we just need to understand that we represent Jesus. We are His ambassadors. And as such, we speak for Him. And we do that with the kindest, gentlest, and most loving way that we can. And we reduce it down to the lowest common denominator. Now, once they understand and they begin to add to that, then you can add more layers to that. And you continue to build on that and go from that. And it won't be long until, if you've done your job right, that you'll be the student and they'll be the teacher. And that's the goal. That's the goal.
Awesome. That's great. That's great. Well, I think we've got it. I really appreciate you talking to me about all this. And I think that genuinely, I'm probably going to get flack from my professor for this. If this wasn't even an assignment, I really enjoyed talking about this. I think it's such a fascinating subject. And as someone who's still growing in their belief, I think that it helps me individually understand something that questions, or at least contemplates God another way. It helps me understand different ways of looking at God. And I really do. And I think the highlight of everything you said was that one statement that I mentioned: God is not an abstract thought. That, or God thing, that right there, it's just such a fascinating idea.
He's
Honestly.
real. He's real. He's real. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you, Mr. McMillen, taking your time out of your day.
Thank you for including me to be a part of your class project. I feel very honored. Been a long time family friend of your family, but I appreciate the honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Alrighty.